Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 5, we're asking, how does tackling SDG 8.7 and the fight to end modern slavery by 2030 work with the UN's other Sustainable Development Goals to create a better and more sustainable world for us all? I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode, published on International Women's Day, I'm delighted to be joined by the Rights Lab's Helen McCabe, who's been looking at the issue of forced marriage and working towards more effective interventions that could put an end to it. I'm also pleased to welcome Karen Sherman, author of Brick by Brick, Building Hope and Opportunity for Women Survivors Everywhere, who joins us from the United States to help us reflect on the connections between efforts to end modern slavery and women's rights, part of the UN's SDG 5. So welcome both of you. Welcome Karen and welcome Helen.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Todd.
It's wonderful to have both of you here, and it's really great to bring two people together who one might think are working on different issues, but the connections between your experiences and what you're working on, the research you're doing, etc., are actually very, very strong. And Karen, I wanted to start with you because I read Brick by Brick and very much enjoyed all of the portraits of the women in the book, your own journey of self-discovery and self-reflection. And one of the things that came out just relevant to this topic to me is this idea of marriage, legalized marriage, inheritance, property rights, all the sorts of things that really are deep issues in many, many countries around the world. If you will, the precarity of women in terms of their own rights. And I wonder if I just start with a kind of general question around your experience of over 30 years working in all over the world about that precarity of women that you've seen and observed and tried to make a difference.
Thanks so much. And, I talked about this whole question of legal marriage, particularly in the context of Rwanda, although it affects women everywhere, as you've just mentioned. And one of the things that I found in my research and time on the ground in Rwanda in particular was that marriage was defined as a civil union between a man and a woman. And in the absence of a legal marriage, all of these wonderful rights that related to child custody, inheritance, property ownership, etc., didn't really convey to women who didn't have a legally sanctioned marriage. And I also wondered, how did that affect women in other countries too? And so, one of the things I did in Rwanda, and I talk about in Brick by Brick, was this convening of legal marriages and having to convince men about why the legal marriage was important, not just to assure the woman's rights, but to assure the rights of their children. And the children's piece seemed to create a more compelling case for why legal marriage was important, how to give your kids a future. But there were still a lot of men in Rwanda in particular who were resistant to the idea of a legal marriage, thinking that it would inhibit them in some way. And I know that traditional marriages in a variety of countries are still the norm. And then in other countries, you have situations where rights are on the books for women, and yet they're not able to access them either because they're not enforced, or women, particularly in peri-urban and rural areas, don't know about those rights.
And so it sounds to me like men might be threatened by this idea of the legalization of marriage.
There is a perception of a reduced freedom. Multiple partners, multiple wives, so to speak, are inhibited if there is a traditional marriage. Men also feel like I'm going to be held accountable financially and otherwise if I'm in a legally sanctioned marriage. And so what you've seen across different communities is men balking at the idea of a legal marriage. But for women, it's one of the main ways, at least in Rwanda, but in other countries as well, to codify their rights.
And Helen, how does that sort of line up with the kind of work that you've been doing?
Well, I would say I've had like 30 days on this grant, not 30 years that Karen's had with this experience. But I think it chimes with a lot of the research that is already coming out, particularly about child marriage, but linked about access to rights, that if people don't have a legal marriage, they can't say they've got any rights, they can't prove their relationships. There's much more chance of them being vulnerable to exploitation in a variety of different ways. I guess thinking specifically about forced marriage.
Could you tell us what forced marriage is?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that people have a right to, both people and parties to a marriage should give their free and full consent to that union. Two things struck me from what Karen was saying. One is about it's even harder to kind of prove there's a forced marriage or not when there's no record of the marriage, and that lots of the efforts that are being made to try and prevent forced early child marriage, which is SDG 5.3, are relying on better record keeping or trying to push for better record keeping, so that you've got a right to have marriages registered, to have people's births registered, and then you can tell whether people are legally of the right age to marry. That really struck me. And then it also struck me because my background is in the history of political philosophy, and the starting point for this grant is thinking through a couple of centuries worth of critique of marriage and slavery, and that there's a kind of story in some of the kind of 19th century critiques of marriage about how it's in many ways really beneficial for women when it is a legal institution, and that men can be bound to go along with it because it does come with rights and it comes with certain structures and recognition. And then there's further questions about whether that also raises problems for women about whether they can get a divorce or not. Obviously, all of that is coloured by different attitudes towards men and women and marriage anyway, about multiple partners tends to only be an option for men. Not having to be responsible for children tends to only be an option for men, etc. So I thought it was really interesting that these are still pertinent questions that should be asking when we're thinking about women's rights and how women have the best kind of access to them, particularly in the context of marriage.
So I just wanted to pick up on this historical point that Helen just made, which is fascinating, and there's certain ironies, I guess, in this that would tease out the modern situation, which is to say, in 19th century United States, the existence of chattel slavery and other forms of slavery, actually legal rights of ownership of one person over another were exercised and codified in law. And of course, with the Civil War and the abolition of slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendments, the U.S. Constitution, etc., we see that disappearing. And in the current era, the definition of modern slavery often talks about people being treated as if they were property, that there is a coercive hold on someone and they are not free to leave their place of work. So I'm interested in this idea of legalizing marriage to protect women's rights, which is in contradistinction of what we hear from history, but at the same time it does give them, it empowers them to make legal claims. And Helen made this other point about just writing it down, that when things were happening, people getting married and that was codified, it even helped just to have a formal record of that, so that in the event of some adverse consequences, a woman could exercise her rights and make legal challenges on that basis.
You know what strikes me about that is because it's a strange dichotomy, isn't it? On the one hand, you need legal marriage to codify women's rights, and on the other hand, you still have 40 million women across Africa being basically forced into marriage before their 15th birthday. And so I think the issue comes down to choice when you're talking about slavery, you're talking about codification of rights, is this idea is, what do women want, and what are they defining in their best interest? Because let's take Rwanda, for example, in the legal marriage. These women wanted a legal marriage. They were finding resistance, perhaps from husbands who didn't want to limit their freedom or the ability to have multiple partners. They wanted the legal marriage to enforce their rights. In the case of early marriage or forced marriage of young women, this isn't a choice. Or in the case of slavery, as you're talking about, women are not choosing to be treated as property. This is something that's a byproduct of that situation. And so I think it comes down to this question of, what do women want?
I think that's really interesting. And again, if you could say more about the Rwandan context, because it's very clear in the book and from our own readings about Rwanda and the evolution since the terrible violence that visited that country, that women actually are increasingly in positions of power, certainly within government. Women's representation within parliament has increased. And with that, pro-women's legislation. I don't know if that's a correct interpretation, but it feels that way from my own reading.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, you know, what we always talk about, having spent 10 years working with women survivors of war and conflict, post-conflict zones around the world, that not that there is a silver lining to war and conflict, but that it does create an opportunity typically for women to be able to renegotiate their rights and roles. And in the case of Rwanda, post-genocide, the population became 70% female because so many men were incarcerated or killed during the genocide, that women were in a position to not only fight alongside men to end the genocide, but to be leading the process in the rebuilding that followed. And you also had a leadership that was really supportive of putting women forward in that rebuilding process. And part of that very proactive and well-respected ministers of gender who have really led on making sure that the legislative framework was in place to promote women's rights across all levels of government and society. And so you really see that manifesting today in terms of the rights that we just talked about for women with legal marriage, but also in terms of mainstreaming in the workplace, even access to rape counseling and support across different ministries, and even one-stop centers for women who are able to report cases of rape and abuse, and perpetrators actually receiving jail sentences in that case. And so I think, from a role model perspective, Rwanda's done a lot of things right, in addition to even having the highest percentage of women in parliament anywhere in the world today.
And it's interesting that this was sort of collective action out of necessity, as well as collective action based on circumstance.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's almost a positive outcome from a very perverse situation. But Karen, you made some really interesting links between other issues within women's life and the women's sphere in terms of the job market, the careers, government, etc., but also education. And another strong theme that comes out of your book is around guaranteeing basic education for all women. How is that connected to some of the other issues that we're discussing here?
From my perspective, and what I have seen not only certainly in Rwanda, but really across my work throughout the former Soviet Union and really throughout societies in transition, is there's two things that make a fundamental difference for women and girls everywhere. One is an education, but the second is the ability to earn an income. And what I have found is education is really important, but the kind of education that young women receive also matter to make sure that they are gaining the skills, the knowledge, the expertise to be able to link up to the workplace, because education does give women more voice, but it's really the income piece that also gives women choices around sending and keeping kids, particularly daughters, in school, choices when a woman is suffering from violence or abuse in the family, choices around how money is saved and spent. And so the choice piece comes with, I think, both education and this ability to connect to the workforce.
And Helen, how does that align with some of the work that you've been doing, this education, empowerment? How does that then relate to this phenomenon of forced marriage? Because you said that a lot of these women who are being forced to marry men are as well younger than 15. So where does the education piece fit into that?
I think it's really important. I think, and there's, I guess, three strands perhaps. So one is when we're thinking about child and early marriage, there seems to be quite a strong correlation to exactly what Karen's been talking about. So girls staying in school get married later. Girls who stay in school have more options about who they marry, more control about how they choose to marry and when and whom they choose to marry. And then there's this interesting relationship between who decides that they stay in school, why they might want to stay in school, and what kind of options they've got after they leave school, and the attention, which I think Karen's also speaking to, that having A-levels or equivalent or a degree, if the only jobs are being a housewife, could be a drawback, because by that point you're sort of 5 years older than people think you should be when you get married, and you're very definitely on the shelf, as we might say here. And so I think parents who are thinking about trying to do the best for their children end up in a tension between wanting to promote their daughter's educational opportunities, let her stay in school, encourage her educational ambitions, and this worry that she won't have any options if she stays in school much longer because people will think she's unmarriageable. I think from the terms of thinking about grown-ups, again, Karen made a great point that people need to be educated about their rights. If they don't know they've got rights to leave marriages, they've got options, that there's support available for them, that there are rights in their country about property, inheritance, sex inside of marriage, support they can have, whether they've got access to their children, then it's just much, much harder to try and leave a marriage if you don't want to be in it, or to assert any kinds of rights inside a marriage if you really don't know you have any. And certainly this thought that there are no other economic options, particularly in cases where you can't even go home because that's not economically viable, your family can't support you or help support you, and particularly you and children. And that we read testimonies from people that are really very trapped then, because even if they try and go home, they get sent back to a marriage they don't really want to be in anymore because of financial reasons. But again, I was just struck by the kind of sort of nothing new under the sun for women. That these are all reasons that people were also thinking through in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century about what is needed to help women achieve meaningful equality. And again, thinking about other conflict examples where you see women taking a bigger role in the workplace because men are at war, or have died or are in prison, and that being a platform for them to move on to in terms of trying to demand further equality. Then, of course, there's a worry about a backlash when there is more gender parity in the country. And I think that's interesting about Karen's book, that men see giving women rights as a limit on their own freedoms, and there's a kind of pushback then about whether they want to give women those kind of rights, those rights they are legally entitled to, and what we do about kind of patriarchal culture that lets those kind of decisions be the ones that make a difference to women.
So I really like what Helen and Karen said there, these incredible intersections between so many different policy domains, for lack of a better word, from education, knowledge, empowerment, choice, agency, women's rights, etc., as well as the threat perception among men, as well as the historical longevity of these enduring problems. One might even call them wicked issues. But I wanted to pick up on another word that Karen uses in her book. In fact, it's in the title of her book. She talks about survivors everywhere, because at the moment, the cases we've been discussing are Rwanda, Afghanistan, former Soviet Union, parts of Africa, etc. But, these are phenomena that affect women everywhere in the world. And certainly on International Women's Day, we should recognize that these are not issues that are isolated by geography. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, Karen, if you could say a bit about, some of these issues within the context of the United States.
I'm sure all of you guys know the statistics about 1 in 3 women are victims of violence. 4 out of 5 victims of human trafficking are girls. I mean, the statistics are astounding, and they're certainly not specific to conflict or post-conflict zones and countries in transition. On my book tour, I've been telling people this statistic, which nobody seems to know, which is that 1 in 16 American women experience rape as their first sexual encounter. And you've heard the statistics as it relates to college campuses across the United States, which is 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women experience some form of sexual assault. So the numbers are absolutely staggering, and certainly not just in the developing world, but across the developed world too. And I think we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg with Me Too and what's happening. And women are starting to find their voice and tell their stories that have long been buried. And one of the reasons I decided to write this book was, for so many years, I have been collecting women's stories across all the work I've been doing as part of program monitoring and evaluation. The story collection was, in fact, data collection. But, hearing women share the most raw and intimate details of their stories made me want to put my own story on the page and really, talk about sort of what I had experienced myself, really for the first time. And what's been interesting across this book tour is other women are coming out with their own stories that they maybe not haven't said out loud. And so there's some connective tissue across women everywhere, this idea of surviving and really moving to a place of thriving. But telling your stories, to me, is part of that healing, that moving on. That's so important.
Absolutely. And, I think with the Weinstein decision recently, we see that there has been a fight back. The court certainly found in favor of the prosecution. And I guess the other question then is the nature of forced marriage. So, forced marriage equally is not something isolated by geography. And I wonder if Helen could just say a few words about the phenomenon of forced marriage across the world.
Thank you for that. I was thinking the same with Karen was saying. It's important to emphasise that forced marriage happens to women across the world. There are regions where it seems more prevalent based on the ILO's current statistics, but there's lots of work to be done about those statistics, making sure that they're actually accurate. So one of the partners on my project is Karma Nirvana, who are the UK's leading charity fighting forced marriage and honour-based crime, and they run the national helpline for people who feel either they or somebody they know might be vulnerable to forced marriage or might be in a forced marriage or be about to be forced into a marriage. And they really struggle against this, basically racist perception in the UK anyway, that it only happens to people who come from South Asia. And although there are lots of cases, and the only one that's currently been successfully prosecuted in the UK was about somebody being taken back to marry a relative in Pakistan, it would be very wrong to think that that's the only communities it affects. And so quite a lot of their work, and what I'm hoping to learn from them as part of the project as it goes on, is all the different communities this affects and how, and whether there are the similar reasons for it, or whether there are different specific typologies of forced marriage that affect different communities. And I think also it's where there's this complicated crossover between expectations that forced marriages happen to young women and where we think it's a forced marriage because of course it's forced, it's a child and they can't consent. Carmen Ivana currently trying to get a law passed in the UK to make child marriage actually illegal because there's quite a big loophole about parental consent here, which means that it's not. And they think that, well, they found that marriages amongst sort of 15-year-olds don't get covered by the Forced Marriage Act because they can't prove coercion. These 15-year-olds are saying, but I want to marry him or her, but mainly him. And this is a problem about actually the UK living up to its expectations under the SDGs and under international legislation, because these are children getting married. And the fact that we might think that it's not a consensual marriage because they're not of age is not something that actually applies under the law. So I'm sure that that's not just a UK specific problem, that it stretches across the globe as well in communities that perhaps in the public imagination aren't as likely to have issues with forced marriage.
I was struck by another thing that Karen said about the disproportionate representation of young girls and women in trafficking, certainly within her statistics about the United States. And one of the things I'm interested in is how effective do we think the language of modern slavery, anti-trafficking, references to the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., will actually help in changing the situation and making lives better for women? In what way do we think this language is helpful?
My 2 cents on that. I mean, it's such an enormous problem, and what we're seeing is certainly greater awareness around trafficking issues at a national level, at an international level, but sort of the root causes of trafficking, which have to do with poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity, that even creates the situation where women are drawn to looking at opportunities outside their community, or they're vulnerable, they're susceptible to that. I think we have to look at it from a variety of different perspectives. There's certainly the legal and the enforcement perspective, but there's also sort of what are those key factors that are creating this vulnerability in the places of origin where women are being trafficked from. I saw that a lot throughout the former Soviet Union or in Central Asia, where women had very little opportunity economically. And so when they were offered these so-called jobs abroad, whether to work as a nanny or to work in a restaurant or to do these things, even though it was completely false, there was like, I need to support my family, I need to have an opportunity. And so there's systemic reasons that human trafficking is such a big issue. And obviously there's the perpetrator issue too, that again, from a legal standpoint, we must address. But I think the human trafficking issue has to be unpacked at multiple levels. I also think, this is just my personal bent, but that trafficking for sex and trafficking for work or domestic labor, they're related and they're important, and they're all forms of trafficking and forms of human slavery, but they have different root causes perhaps and need to be unpacked a little bit more, because there's a tendency to lump everything together, and they're not the same thing.
And that's exactly the sorts of things we've been discussing on the rights track, is the definitional questions, the differential root causes for a phenomena that we observe, and the rush, if you will, or the tendency to group apples and oranges together and call them pears. And I think that's absolutely makes it very problematic for intervention and policy responses and attempts to help people around the world. So Helen, I don't know if you have any further observations on that particular point.
Just a couple. I think that certainly the UN Special Rapporteur on slavery and the causes of slavery has really felt that this link between servile marriage, forced marriage and slavery is a way to get the global community on board with really taking forced marriage seriously and the commitments in SDG 5.3 seriously. Because as noted in the report she's written, there's a much more global commitment to the idea that slavery is wrong and we should not have it anymore, and probably much less buy-in to gender equality in a lot of places. So I think she sees it certainly as a way in which action on gender equality can be leveraged from other people's existing commitments to ending human trafficking and to ending slavery. Some of the research we've done already on the project has just been an initial deductive analysis of existing narratives from people who have experienced forced marriage and are also classed as having experienced modern slavery. I'm really interested in how people who've experienced forced marriage describe it. Like, do they think about it as a form of slavery, and in what ways? But our initial research showed really interesting connections between forced marriage, slavery and trafficking, and that it can happen at all sorts of different stages in someone's experience of slavery and trafficking. So it could be that someone is threatened with a forced marriage, so they try and leave their local area and they maybe move to a town to get away from their family who want to marry somebody they don't want to marry, and then they're vulnerable to trafficking and to exploitation of different kinds. Some people are trafficked for different kinds of labour, could be sexual labour, could be domestic labour, and along the route they end up being forced into marrying somebody, and then something else happens. Some people were kind of found by NGOs through a kind of tackling forced marriage project, and then it kind of came out about a long past experience of different kinds of modern slavery and human trafficking experiences. So I think you're right about this apple, pears and oranges problem. Forced marriage is invidious. It seems to happen to people at lots of different stages, and in all those different ways in which all those different causes of forced marriage, all of them can leave people vulnerable to different kinds of modern slavery and trafficking.
The last question I have is for Karen, really. The other word you use in the title of your book is building hope. And so I'd like to end on a positive note, which is, if we are to build hope, what are the sort of brick by brick, if you will, or what are the components of building this hope? I think we need to really think about what are the positives that come from this conversation.
Those words were chosen very carefully, because when I was at Women for Women International, we talked about moving women from victims to survivors to active citizens. And what I loved about the work that I was doing with the organization was, even though these women had suffered horrific atrocities, whether it's war, genocide, systemic rape used as weapons of war, the organization never saw or treated them as victims. They were always potential agents of change, capable of transforming their lives and in turn the lives of their families and communities. And I've really seen that. We know all the statistics about women being the gateway to the family. And when women are economically empowered, the family is economically empowered. And so I really think this idea of, when you're taking women who have lost everything, their husbands, their children, their livelihoods, and even in their dignity to a certain extent through war and conflict, there is an opportunity for women to be able to rebuild their lives, literally a brick at a time, through education and economic opportunity. And so, I think that healing process starts, A, when women are able to tell their stories in a safe space, and B, when they have the support of social networks from other women and communities that want to help move women forward. But giving women a stake in the economy, a chance to have a future, and in turn create a future for their own children, to me is a very hopeful message.
That's great. I think that in terms of International Women's Day, the message you're bringing after many, many years, talking to so many women around the world, the work that Helen's doing here with forced marriage and conceptions of modern slavery and intervention strategies, etc., is a hopeful message for us all on this day. And it just leaves it to me to say thank you very much for both of you joining us, Karen Sherman from the United States and Helen McCabe here in the Rights Lab.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about Karen's book, Brick by Brick, Building Hope and Opportunity for Women Survivors Everywhere, at karensherman.org, and about our podcast at rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and first large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery.